The rivers woke before the people did. From the eastern sky, a wash of color seeped into the world. Palest pink lifted from a water lily and pressed along the horizon. It touched the red fork and the tumblestone, and the cold running channels, between the reeds, where small things stirred and vanished. Mist lay in the hollows of the fields and drifted in faint columns off the moat. River Run's walls were dark with dew, the towers banded with damp, like the rings in age-old oak. On the outer bailey, a groom tapped a hoofpick against iron, 3 notes knocking hollow and thin. In the kennels, hounds traded sighs and turned, noses tucked beneath their flanks. The air tasted of wet stone and trout, and something green that had not yet decided whether it belonged to leaf or to moss. In the godswood, all these scents were softened and deepened. Old water collected beneath roots and sent up a sweetness like rain held in cupped hands. Robb Stark stood beneath the bent bough of a birch whose papery bark peeled in curls, and watched the first light reveal the weirwood's face. It had never been truly exiled from him even in the south. The white bark's bleeding leaves were the same in Winterfell as here, the red eyes following, the carved mouth an old wound in a stranger's cheek. He had never decided whether the faces were all the same or all different. Each morning he began to think he knew, and each evening he doubted it. When a gust came, the leaves moved like breath, and he told himself he felt his father in it. He spoke aloud, just enough so the dew could hear. "I will bring her to your eye," he said, and heard how strange it sounded. Grey Wind was a pale shadow at the edge of the pool, not so pale as in the snow, but striking all the same. A gray pelt hatching into charcoal along spine and tail, ears twitching at the fall of a single leaf. The direwolf padded to the water and lowered his muzzle. Robb looked past him to the reflection of the castle mirrored with a wavering seam, to the broken oval of the sun rising like a coin prized out of mud. He did not ask the old gods for signs. They had given him some already, poured at him like wine and blood, and he had been made to drink. To ask again felt gluttonous. The wind fingered the hair along his temple and withdrew. "Your Grace," said a voice from the edge of the trees. It was small to be rolling such a title into the quiet, but Robb did not wince. He turned. Brynden Tully stood with one hand on a weeping willow, the other at his sword belt, a man in the hour when iron and duty have not yet put on their day's weight. The blackfish's hair had more silver in it than it had 6 months ago, though no man would have dared to say so. Between his brows was the permanent furrow of a riverman who listened to too many currents at once. "They're on the road," Brynden said. "Enough banners to be polite, not enough to be foolish. Roses and the striding huntsman and Hightower's white stone, they let us see the Florent tusks, which is brazen or clever, and I'm not yet sure which." "Lord Randall?" Robb asked. "In the second rank," Brynden said. "That would be clever then. He wants you to see him and know he came, and remember he did not come first." Robb breathed, and the godswood breathed with him. The blackfish's mouth flattened in some private amusement. "Your mother is awake," Brynden added. "She has been awake these past 2 hours, I think." "She always was first to rise," Robb said. "In Winterfell, when I was small and the kitchen's not yet stirring, she would walk the walls. She used to tell me the frost is truest at dawn." "A Riverlands woman of the north," Brynden said. "The best sort of bridge." He inclined his head toward the weirwood and the water. "Will you have a few breaths more, and then come? Or shall we go together now?" He looked past Robb to Grey Wind, calculation careful in his eyes, as if measuring the distance between man and beast, and wondering if it could be widened by conversation. "I will come," Robb said and stepped forward. Grey Wind's head came up, water threading off his whiskers, eyes like wet iron. "We have much to do." Brynden fell into step beside him. On the way out of the godswood, the dew along the path darkened their boots like blessing or warning. Robb could not tell which. Behind them the leaves stirred once and went still. The courtyards grew busy as the castle woke. A shirtless boy carried a pail and left a trembling trail as he hurried. A woman with her hair in a rough knot held a loaf against her hip and walked as if she meant to master distances with bread. The smell from the ovens turned the air warmer. Little Edmure's hounds still, though the blackfish had their hearts now, wove among ankles, and considered which men were likely to drop what they carried. A stable hand cupped his hands and made a leap of sound that spooked a pigeon into the air. Above it all, the battlements wore their thin veil of mist like a soft shifted banner. Robb saw his men. He always saw them now, even when he did not look for them. The great Jones boom along a gallery, a hammer stroke of laughter. Dour Rickard Karstark walking a narrow length of wall with the focus of a man who had used grief as a whetstone and sharpened himself to dangerous edge. Mage Mormont in a leather jerkin thick at the shoulders, hair like a bear's pelt in the rain. Roose Bolton, pale as the underside of a trout, overseeing a knot of Dreadfort men who mended straps with a neatness that suggested their hands knew more delicate work than leather. Caitlin stood at the top of the stone stair from the inner ward and watched her son come. She had put on a gown of blue, the exact color of the Tumblestow's deep pools, embroidered with a spray of river flowers at the shoulder that she had stitched with her own hands, stubbornly pricking her fingers like a girl in a maiden's tale, until the pattern lay as she wanted it. Her hair, more auburn than chestnut now that the sun had burned some summer into it, was bound back simply. She had never mastered the fashion of the South with its ropes and nets and pearls. There had been a time she had tried, when she was younger and Riverrun's halls had seemed larger for all that she understood them less. But the weight of too fine a headpiece gave her headaches, and the Starks had required less of her. She put her palm to Robb's cheek when he came near and felt his stubble and the warmth of his life. She had learned, in strange new ways, not to take either for granted. "You were with the gods?" she asked. "I tried to be," he said. "Sometimes they honor us by being silent." She said, "When I was a girl, I would run to the godswood and whisper my secrets and feel sure I had been heard because the leaves moved. It took me years to realize they move whether we speak or not. And yet I will keep speaking," he said. "A mother's allowed to be pleased by that." She said, and smiled. Beyond them, on the outer road, the first of the Reach banners came into view. The Tyrell roses were a simple device, a flower in a field of green, and yet no man mistook them. The green was the particular green of leaves that have just been rubbed between finger and thumb and released. The gold was honest sunlight, not the brassy coin gold some lords favored. Beneath the banners marched men in surcoats trimmed in leaf piping, and behind them carts with wheels bound in iron, and behind the carts the long hiss of cloth as a litter moved, its curtains shifting to show for a breath the pale cream of a hand or the gleam of a ring. "Grandmother," said the young knight at the fore with a sweetness sharpened like a knife. "Behold the north." "You hush," said the old woman beside him. "The north has been here longer than your sweet head has had hair on it." Olenna Tyrell rode not in a litter, but in a small carriage with iron-banded wheels and a cushioned seat that did nothing to soften the impression of steel in her spine. A shawl of some southern silk lay over her shoulders, and pins in the shape of tiny bees held it, as if she trusted even now that her sweetness would draw and keep what she wanted. Beside her rode Loras Tyrell in a surcoat of forest green, with a climbing trellis sewn upon it in pale gold. His hair was brushed to a shine and fell like a poured thing to his jaw. His mouth was beautiful and bitter. Garland Tyrell was to his left, broader through the chest, wearing a half smile as if he knew how to carry both weight and courtesy. Mace Tyrell came later, a man of lordly girth and assured incompetence, but it was perhaps to his credit that he had let others ride closer to the front. The litter was near enough now that Robb could see the play of shadow inside. The curtains opened. Margaery Tyrell looked out. It would have been easy for a man to speak poetry about her, and many had, but none of them had been Robb Stark. He watched as a soldier does, who is also a boy who loved horses first and learned to read the wind. He saw what moved and what did not. Her eyes did not flinch from the castle, nor from the line of archers along the wall. She studied them as if she had grown up in a place of many walls and learned that stone, like people, differs. She lifted a hand. It was not a wave. Something smaller, weightier. A salute that acknowledged the river and the roof and the unseen bones beneath the soil. When she looked at him, She did not look away as so many had when Grey Wind stepped forward to the edge of the drawbridge and sniffed the air like a lord at a feast. Lord Tyrell, Catelyn said lowly, was not the first to ask to come ahead, but it was not the worst thing to oblige his mother. Her voice fitted around the word mother, with an old warmth that did not make her foolish. Your Grace, said Loras Tyrell when he drew rein in the yard. He slid from the saddle with the practiced grace of a man who made such motions as music. If I say you are handsomer than rumor, will you forgive me? I might, Robb said, and smiled, and found he liked the young man less for his polished edge, and more for what sat behind his eyes like a bruise. You came with banners enough to make River Run look festive. My grandmother thought it wise to be seen, Loras said. That I did, Olenna said from her little carriage, not bothering to let a man announce her. I don't intend to have my girl vanish into a northern fog, not when southern fools are counting how many steps she takes and with which foot she takes them. It is useful that some of those fools should see her take these steps too. Margaery lowered the litter step with her own hand and came down. The gown she wore was the color of cream warmed by a sun through thin linen, and it had been embroidered along the hem and sleeves with leaves in the green of a reach summer and snowflakes picked out in white silk. She had the look of one who could wear fur without asking pardon of the beast and silk without apology to those whose hands had spun it. When she came to Catelyn, she did not bow over much. My lady, she said, and her voice was a southern bell rung softly. Thank you for receiving me. This is my son, Catelyn said. And then the words were not enough, and she touched Robb's sleeve and felt the arm beneath, the realness of him that no title could render. Your Grace, Margaery said. And then, as if they had both decided to be braver than their advisors, she smiled. I have been told that your winters teach a different sort of patience. They teach everyone, Robb said. Even lords, and perhaps especially queens, she said, so calmly that the yard remembered to breathe, and then made the smallest of inclinations, not deep enough for submission, true enough for respect. Grey Wind came forward a step. The murmur in the yard dropped to a thread. The direwolf's breath fogged and unwound like smoke. Margaery did not reach for him. She did not make the errors courtiers made around horses, but she did not step back either. She allowed her veil of scent, some herb, some clean something from a garden after rain, to move toward him on the air and be evaluated. Grey Wind's ears crooked forward and back. He lowered his head. Robb felt, rather than saw. The moment, the animal's judgment passed and filed away. Margaery was not prey. He did not yet know if she was pack. Bring them into the hall, Catelyn said before the river breezes could make a spectacle of manners. They have eaten on the road, no doubt, which is never true nourishment. The ovens are ready. True nourishment is politics, Olenna said. But I will eat your bread. There were forms and formalities. Brynden Tully saw to the exchange of bread and salt, with a precision that bordered affection. He had the look of a man giving his niece into a storm and arranging for her to carry the right kind of lantern. The Reachmen admired the great hall's tapestries with tact. The Northmen admired the Hightower men's neatness, with something that might have been contempt or amusement. Lord Randall Tarley's profile was all clean lines and control. He stood by a window as if calculating what angles of morning light might make a man appear more or less prepared to kill. Roose Bolton's mouth made a small pale line that might have been a smile, and his eyes were winter behind glass. In the smaller solar, where maps lay pinned with knives and stones, they made the first attempt to speak plainly. Catelyn sat with her hands folded and listened. Robb sat with one glove unbuttoned, the better to feel the edges of the riverlands beneath his fingers. Margaery stood behind Olenna's shoulder and watched how men positioned their cups. We do not pretend the South will bless this, Olenna said. We do not require their blessing. We require supply, which we can furnish, and we require a husband for my granddaughter, who is not in love with his own reflection. That disqualifies most of the capital. You require protection, Robb said, from Lannister reprisal. We require a future, Margaery said then, and every head turned because she had chosen her moment well. For the Reach's fields, not Ash. For our small folk, not promises. For my brothers, not the smell of wildfire to wake them. King or Lord, forgive me. I was raised to speak a certain word first. You offer your men something beyond an old feud's ledger. We seek the same. Men know. And in return? Rickard Karstark asked, voice scraping like a file across a blade. You send us grain? And pretty talk. In return, Margaery said, we send you harvests that did not burn, and men who trained with spear and shield from 12, and ships from the Mander and Old Town, and the Shield Islands, and a way south that does not end at a trident full of corpses. We send you names tied to other names in a web dense enough to catch coin. And we send me, which is not small, if you believe in such things. Ben? Debney? Do you? The Great John asked, grinning. Teeth like white stones in a fast stream. I believe in the uses of belief, Margaery said, and in bread, and in knowing which way the wind comes from, and why. Bread is sound, said Mage Mormont. Wind is treacherous. Then I shall learn to read it as your bears do, Margaery said, and for the first time Meg's mouth quirked. You are eloquent, Randall Tarley said, not precisely as a compliment. My mother made certain of it, Margaery said, and put a hand on Olenna's shoulder. Your mother did nothing, Olenna said. But I did. If you are to be queen to a boy who wants to be a man before his beard is filled in, you must be able to talk the world into holding still while you sew up what the men tear. She leaned forward. And you, boy wolf? Are you more than your father's shadow? Robb felt the sting, recognized the aim, respected it. I do not know, he said. Most days I am less. Some days I am more. On the days when it matters, I try to be enough. Olenna considered him as a chess player, considers a man who has chosen to sacrifice a minor piece for a better rank. Well, she said and settled back. We have come to marry my granddaughter to you, and to make enemies accordingly. The seven will have their blessing in the sept, Mace Tyrell said hastily, as if to lacquer the conversation with piety. And, well, there will be food. There will be rights in the Godswood, Robb said. And we will recognize the seven's blessing too. The Riverlands have many gods at the banks. We will not ask you to bow to ours, Margaery said. We will stand beneath both. We will let the people see. Caitlyn's hands shifted. Against her will, some weight between her ribs eased. She had dreamed of standing between a weirwood and a sept all her life, and making them hear one another. If the day had slowed then, it would have been enough. But the day, like all days under banners, had the speed of men's appetites. Tailors and seamstresses were fetched. Tapes worthy of Vinetown and Winterfell at once were unfurled. The kitchen grew loud with lemon and with venison, with the wet slap of trout and the sing of onion sliced fine. There are weddings where love is hidden like a thread beneath the outer cloth and only revealed when worn thin. There are weddings where love is spectacle. This was neither. This was a treaty made generous. Margaery's women moved around her, but she was never still. She spoke with the dyer about the exact softness of a green that would not look gaudy against stone. She asked a guardsman his name and his mother's and remembered both. She sent a basket to the infirmary with comfrey and clean rags, because she would have this hall smell less of fear. When a lady from House Piper pressed a polished shell into her hand from some river bend her grandmother had walked. Margaery listened to the story of that grandmother longer than she needed to. She let the small things build a bridge. She had been told the North would resist her. She had not been told it would be so hungry to believe it might be wrong. Robb spent an hour with Edmure, a half hour with the Blackfish, 2 with his mother. He sent riders to the twins with a message written cold as a contract and warm as a family pledge. Edmure Tully would take Rosalind Frey to wife with all honor and the river's witness, and Walder Frey would be given 3 lines in the ballads instead of 2. He dispatched halberdiers to the gatehouse with quiet instructions about vigilance, but not paranoia. He sat with Roose Bolton and heard how the man liked to have each order repeated once and then never again. He heard the Great John sing something lewd and knew he would not have such songs at his children's naming days, and then wondered at the ease with which the word children had come to him. When he told Grey Wind to heal, the direwolf did so, as if humorously obliging a friend. At noon, the Septon came with his quiet eyes and his book. At noon, the trees listened. River Run Sept was a low building with a rose window of river glass that caught light in green and let it go in gold. The Godswood lay not so far that one could not walk from one to the other and feel the breath change in one's chest, and the old prayers coil and uncoil in different shapes. To please both gods and politics, the wedding was made of 2 vows braided as a single rope. The Sept was first. It smelled of beeswax and of stone warmed by breath, and the light from the glass window made reverent map shapes on the floor. Margaery wore a circlet of narrow silver with a single green gem set like a leaf tip over her brow. Her hair was dressed simply, southern softness pinned in northern restraint. She took Robb's hands and did not lower her eyes when the Septon spoke. He was not an elaborate man. He spoke about bread. He spoke about sharing weather. He wished them children strong in limb and spirit, in case the gods were listening with half an ear, and needed such plainness to catch the sense. Then, in the Godswood, the carved red mouth waited. The air was cooler and sweet with rot that was not decay but return. A deep green breath that Robb had known before he knew the names of flowers. The North Lord stood with faces like old bark that had learned to shift a little for sunlight. The Reach Lords stood slightly tense, as if too much reverence for the unseen might make their hands less sure at a table. And yet none of them could deny what the place did. It pressed quiet into them without scold. Robb touched the white bark. He felt the grain. That was all he had ever done, and it was enough. He turned to Margaery and took the ribbon of cloth his mother had had woven by a woman who remembered the tincture of elderberry, and whose fingers moved in patterns her grandmother had taught her with bread dough. The ribbon was blue and gray, green and white. He tied it around Margaery's wrist and then around his own. He did not speak fancy words. He said, "When my house is hungry, I will feed you." He said, "When your house is wrong, I will tell you so." He said, "When I am afraid, I will not lie to you." She lifted her chin just a little. She said, "When the hall is empty of song, I will fill it." She said, "When you become your men's anger, I will lead you back to yourself." She said, "When you forget to rest, I will make you." No gods cried out. No ravens fell from the sky. The weirwood's leaves moved as leaves do, in patterns no one reads until long after, if at all. The ribbon was tied, and then cut and shared, a length to each of them, and a piece to Catelyn, a piece to Olenna, a small bit saved for a bundle to be kept with rosemary and clean linen. The air had the feeling the air has when something very old has been satisfied without being moved. The feast was less church and more river. Tables were set with boards of smoked trout, their skins an iridescent story of water and sun, with venison roasted until it yielded, and beef stewed with barley and carrots sweet as memory, with round oatcakes crisp at the edge and soft in the middle, with pies from the Reach crammed with pigeon and ham, and a whisper of something herbal that made the Northmen pretend not to notice they liked it. There were rose-hip tarts with the glaze so fine it shone like a thin pond at dusk. There were little glasses of arbor gold and heavier cups of dark ale. Someone got a lute. Someone else told him to stop. Someone else told him to keep going. The blackfish smiled the smile men use when they know a room will live in them after they leave it. Margaery danced with Robb once, and then with Edmure, and then with a boy so young his ears burned, and she made each of them feel she belonged to the song and to their house both. Robb danced with her again and found that his feet, trained more often to stirrup and stirrup leather, could remember some other grammar. He did not step on her. She laughed once, quick, not at him but at the small ludicrousness of bodies arranged in circles to prove they mean peace. Olenna spoke with Catelyn over a small plate of candied orange peel and nuts. "You think I am giving you a granddaughter?" she said. "I am giving you a garden." "I think you are giving me a woman," Catelyn said. "And that is more than most men ever manage." Olenna made a sound that might have been approval. "Keep your men fed. It is easier to keep them brave than to keep them sensible. But feed them. Sensible or brave, they do less harm with bread in their bellies." "Bread is a sacrament here," Catelyn said. "As it is where you come from." The shape of the loaves differs, is all. Your sister-in-law will have been a handful, Olenna said suddenly, as if at random. That Lysa. A woman who could make milk curdle by talking to it. One does what one can with family. Caitlyn's lips pressed. One does. Margaery will make you proud, Olenna said. And the simplicity of it gave it weight. Try not to kill every man who makes that harder. When the candles burned down and the noise gentled, when the great John had given up on pressing a cup into the direwolf's mouth, and decided instead to boast that he could best the beast at a drinking bout of raw air, when Mage Mormont had told Loras Tyrell a thing about ice that made him for once shut up and listen, when Randyll Tarly had stood very still at the door and counted the men he would need to place on each wall to repulse what kind of a turn, then forced himself to stop counting and the wedding chamber was not grand. It had been Caitlyn's as a girl once. It had been made warm with riverwood and a hearth and simple benches worn smooth by shawls pulled over knees while the rain drummed. The bed had been turned down by a woman who had done so for 3 generations and had opinions about how sheets ought to feel that did not change with kings. The fire was banked with care. The arrow slit admitted the river's breath and no more. If the walls remembered other nights and other vows kept and broken, they did not say. Robb closed the door and stood with his back to it, as if holding the world out with his shoulders. Margaery did not pretend shyness she did not feel. She set her hand on the post of the bed and looked at him, not as a court looks when it judges whether a man wears his doublet well, but as a partner looks who will have to lie down in all his decisions. I have seen battle only from a distance, she said. Not because I was afraid, because they kept me from it. I have seen its result up close. I have seen both, he said, and found his voice less sure than on a dais or by a table. And sometimes I think the up close is worse. We will try to choose what we do close to, she said. He laughed then. Quiet, with relief that this was how they spoke to one another, with tenderness that he could feel in his fingers before he felt it anywhere else. He came to her. He touched her cheek, then her hair, then the hollow at the base of her throat. He moved as carefully as if she were a new map, and he a man weary of being lost. She kissed him as if the day had been long, and this was the first thing that had been only theirs. When he loosened the lacing at her back, he did not stumble. When she took his hand and set it against skin that had rarely known winter, he did not think of snow with dread but with promise, of how one could build shelter against it and make a home that sang while the wind pressed its long palm against the walls. They learned, as people do, with the particular wonder of strangers who intend to be less so. Outside, a small rain came and was dismissed by the slate. A log shifted in the hearth with the sound of a body turning in sleep. In the morning, there were ravens. There are always ravens. They come when there is joy and try to dampen it. And they come when there is sorrow and cannot make it worse. And they come when there is nothing at all, and then there is. Robb took the first message with his hands still smelling of ash from the fire he had coaxed up himself. The Blackfish read with him. Caitlyn stood at the window and watched men saddle. Lord Frey will accept, Brynden said. If Edmure agrees to come to the twins for the wedding and give him the honor of hosting the union. Walder Frey wants to count his grandchildren against our bread, Caitlyn said. He wants to set the tally up in the hall like a song and ask us to sing along. We will go, Robb said, but not unguarded, not foolish, and with a net made of other promises. We will take our own food, Caitlyn said. We will bring our own minstrels. We will set in the courtyard tents that do not require his leave to be quiet or loud. We will eat salt on our own plates. The Tyrells will not come to the twins, Olenna said later in the day. When the matter was put to them, and the Solars seemed smaller for so many stiff opinions trying to stand at once. Or if we do, we will do so with enough men that your bridge will look like a child's toy. And that would be gauche. We will go to the twins for Edmure, Robb said, and we will send those we can trust to stand in the Reach's stead. We will see that Lord Frey has his pride, and not our throats. We will send Garland, Margaery said. He's more of a soldier than he looks, and less of a song. Loras we need here until the men stop looking at him like a statue. Father must remain because father must remain. Randall will go where he believes a fight may be needed, but I will ask him to stay. He will not like it, and that will amuse me." "Then you speak as if we are already one household," Rickard Karstark said. "We married yesterday," Margaery said. "If we are not such already, we have done a poor job." She began to make the hall hers in small ways, and none of them violent. She changed little of the kitchen that did not need changing, except to ask that the ovens send more loaves to the garrison and fewer sweetmeats to the high table. She said she would rather taste honey on mornings when the sun had behaved itself than every day until honey was nothing. She went to the infirmary each afternoon and did not flinch. She saved her softest voice for boys on pallets with fever and men with fear of fevers they had seen take their brothers. She walked the inner wall at dawn with Caitlin, shawls pulled up, and learned that the river's voice changed with the angle of wind, and that you could tell a storm by how the rooks behaved on the alder. She learned that Grey Wind would let her put her hand on his head if she did not try to do so, and simply sat long enough in the grass while he lay down near her. She learned to move in fur without becoming clumsy. She learned where, in River Run, one could stand and hear 3 songs at once. A child's humming in a courtyard, a pot banging in the kitchen, a bow over strings in a guardroom. On those days when the sky lay low, she brought flowers not from the reach. There were none, but dried rose hips packed carefully and strung with river grasses. The North women looked at that and thought, "She is clever." The Reach women looked at it and thought, "She remembers." Robb found that the shape of his hours changed. He had been a man who rose with news and ran at it with his sword lifted. He now rose with news and put it on a table with bread, and looked at it from 3 sides. He used maps as less of a mirror and more of a tool. He asked Loras how men like him would take a hill. He asked Meg Mormont how a bear crossed ice when it could not hear the sea beneath. He set Tully men to the fords, and Tyrell men to the supply trains, and Bolton men to the counting of what passed. And then he set another man to count the counters. He sent ravens north to the neck to moat Kalin with letters that did not ask but declared, and to White Harbor with promises about grain that would come down the Mander and up the Bight. Wyman Manderley replied in a hand so florid it almost sang, and when Robb read it aloud, Margaery laughed and said, "I should like to meet that lord. He writes like a fat man who is pleased with his own jokes, which is to say a man one can depend upon." And from the west, from the Gold Lands, there came tidings, and from the Iron Islands there came another. The Ironborn had tasted farther up the coast than was polite this season, and Deepwood Mott sent word of axes in the trees. Robb felt a tug in his marrow then, a pull that had a name he did not speak aloud. Home. But he did not stand up and call for his horse. He sat. He asked for Garland. "Your brother knows the way a sword sings," Robb said to Margaery when they were alone, an hour after he had spoken to Garland himself. "But Garland knows when a song should be quiet. I will send him with a Riverlord company to speak to Walder Frey with Edmure. I will send the great Jones men as well. We will make the Twins a place where pride feels as if it has been fed." "And how?" "And you?" she asked. "I will send Karstark to the fords with men who do not carry grief like a lamp," he said. "I will send Roose to Harrenhal, which is a belly that swallows men if they do not keep their hands on their knives. I will send Mage to the crossings the Lannisters light to pretend they have forgotten exist. And then I will sit at River Run and not move for 3 days. 3. She tilted her head. 2. He said and grinned, and felt 20 for a breath. 7 hours. 5, she said, and let her fingertips skim the back of his hand. "Do you trust me enough to tell me when the thing you want most is to move?" He looked at her and saw not roses, but river. "Yes," he said. "Yes." On the second evening after the wedding, the rain came in sheets, and then in tender fingers, like both story and lullaby. Loras Tyrell sparred with 2 northern boys, and neither had the courtesy to let him win nor the foolishness to make him more their enemy than he wished to be. The Blackfish taught a page to tie a knot that would not slip when the boat bucked. Caitlin wrote to Sansa as if letters could cross distances politics had closed, and she did not blot the ink when it blurred. Olenna wrote to no one that anyone saw, and yet ravens moved on her errands all the same, as if bees had learned to fly in the dark, with notes tied to their legs. At dusk, Margaery stood in the godswood. She had come alone and then not. Grey wind had found her, and lay near, eyes half closed, ears flicking to the slightest stir of leaf. The weirwood looked down at her with its bleeding mouth. She looked up at it with the courtesy she gave to old things that knew their power. She did not pray. She did tell it a thing. "I am from a land where the rain warms you," she said, low enough not to wake the wolf. "Here it teaches you to stand near a fire. I have always liked both. I will not pretend to be what I am not, but I will be what I am well. If you require me to be still sometimes, I can practice. If you require me to speak, I will not hold back. If you require me to learn the names of these trees one by one, I will. I have learned harder names." Then no. The wind moved and did not move. Somewhere beyond the wall a horse shook, and the once silver sound of its bit carried across wet air. Margaery reached up and touched the white bark with her fingertips, and then turned and went back to the hall. The raven came the next morning when the clouds had broken, the sky showing itself between them like a shirt linen between armors. It bore a seal not of lion nor kraken, but of a trout. The small grace of news from a friendly hand. Edmure sent word he had reached the twins, and that Lord Frey had said words that, if placed end to end, would bridge a river with apology and leave it just dry enough for men to cross with dry boots. Robb read, and his jaw eased. He read the postscript twice. It said, in Edmure's careful hand, that Rosalind Frey smiled like a girl who likes sweet things, and is not yet weary of having them taken. "Good," Robb said to the blackfish. "Better. Good enough for a day without stomach ache," Brynden said. "Send a bird to White Harbor," Robb told the maester. "Tell Lord Manderley we will need flour, and that we shall pay with the Reach's coin in kind." "And to Old Town?" the maester asked. "To Old Town," Margaery said, stepping into the solar. "To the High Tower, to my father's allies. The presses will run, and we will take the grain by barge up the Mander, and by cart to King's Landing if need be, but not to them." "You mean to starve them?" Rickard Karstark said from the threshold, his voice not disapproving exactly, but not kind. "I mean to stop feeding them," Margaery said. "There is a difference. A queen keeps account of the ovens." "None." The day moved. The river rose and fell, as if the castle itself breathed through it. A baker's boy burned a crust and wept and was forgiven. 2 Reach men and 1 North man learnt between them that they could make a better spear wall together than either alone, and then all 3 forgot who had taught and simply kept what work. A woman brought Margaery a tiny charm made of reed and straw, knotted in a northern pattern that meant, "Hold for your belly when it fills," she said. And Margaery took it and felt how words sit differently when spoken by women whose hands smell of river and soap. She put the charm in a small wooden box with a carved rose on its lid that she had brought from Highgarden, and told herself to remember who had given it and when. In the evening, Robb and Margaery stood on the east wall and watched the sky gather its colors, where the river thinned to a graceful thread. "On a night like this in the Reach," she said, "the frogs sing as if they are praising or warning. I could never decide." "Ear is full of them. Here you hear different things. The water," he said, "and the wind and the alder," she said, "and a fox perhaps, and a woman in a house near the miller scraping the bottom of a pot." "You hear that?" he asked, surprised. "I listen," she said, and after a moment, "Will you tell me the stories your father told you?" He told her of the first Stark to cross the neck and lay claim, and how men look differently at a king who walks into a marsh and finds his way through. He told her of the wolf dens near the Wolfswood, and the boys who played at being wild and learned the wrong parts too well. He told her of the heart tree at Winterfell, and how the frost grew around its roots like white fingers. She told him of the apple orchards of the Mander, whose blossoms fell like a dance of small white birds. of the Hightower's lamps lit for ships and lovers both, of the harvest festivals in fields so wide you could blink and still not see the end of them. He laughed at some of it. He went quiet at some of it. He thought about how all of it could be made to belong. When the light had gone and the first star placed itself politely in a patch of clear sky, a raven came, black against black, until it was near enough to catch what little light remained and burn it in its eyes. It had a ribbon with it, blue for Edmure, and a smaller strip of green for Riverrun, a Reach woman's courtesy. Robb untied the ribbon and took the message. It was very short. Edmure had written, "Lord Frey makes much of honor. He asks if the Queen of the North will favor his hall with her presence soon, when it is proper. He asks it kindly, and with too many words, so I do not mistake kindness for anything but a cloth on a table." Robb folded the message and put it in his belt. The wind pressed a cool palm against the back of his neck. "Not yet," Margaery said before he spoke, because she had seen his shoulders and learned them. "But soon, with our own bread." "With our own bread," Robb said. They stood, as men and women do sometimes, at the edge of a plan that has not yet set its teeth in the world. The night smelled of river and iron and sweet hay. Somewhere far in the Reach, rain fell on roses and washed dust from their leaves. Somewhere far in the north, a wolf lifted its head and considered a horizon it could not see and yet knew. They did not look away. They stood as if there were roots in their feet, not to keep them from moving, but to ensure that when they did, they would not be torn up. In the hall behind them, a candle guttered and then caught again. In the God's Wood, the leaves moved. The rivers went on speaking, as they had before men made things out of stones and names, and would after. And in the space between breath and vow, in the cool quiet where a life turns into many, the North and the Reach began to teach one another their songs. K. The day that followed had the clean, rinsed look a river gives a field after a night of honest rain. At first light, the flagstones shone, and the roofs wore beads like a jeweler's trick. The smell of wet oak and horse and yeast rolled through the yard in thin, tempting threads. A wood pigeon cooed twice, and then thought better of a third. In the mews, a goshawk shook herself, opened one wing, and then the other, as if counting the sky, and settled. Men who had drunk too much the night before walked carefully and pretended they had not. Men who had drunk the right amount walked as if the floor had agreed to bear them a little longer. Robb broke his fast with barley bread, trout smoked until the flesh flaked like soft wood, and a slice of cheese that had known 3 summers. Margaery, who had tried the same cheese the day before and found it too blunt to be polite to, tried it again and liked it better for how it insisted on what it was. They sat at the small table in the solar and let the great hall undertake its own clamor without them. Caitlin came once to the door and did not enter, because she saw the way their heads bent together over a map and a plate and liked it. "Deepwood Mott first?" Margaery asked, touching the map lightly with the back of her knuckle. "If the Ironborn push farther into the pines, they will not only make off with timber, but with boys. The iron taste is in them. The Glovers hold still," Robb said. "But they cannot hold against raid after raid if the raiders learn the paths. A hard party from Barrowton will have the quickest way through, if the barrows give way at all. If I call the Mormonts, they will come without being called." "Met him, Sal?" "They already have," she said. "Mage woke a bear in the night and told it where to go." He smiled in spite of himself. "And you will write to Old Town again." "To Old Town," she said. "And to my grandmother's friends who pretend they never had a friend if the King in King's Landing asks them. When the barges touch the Mander with their keels, I will know. And when they are unloaded in White Harbor, I will know again. Lord Manderley will tell me even if he does not tell you. He is that sort of man." "Damn." "He told me what sort he is in his last letter," Robb said, and pulled it from beneath the weight of a small stone that had been polished by the river until it looked like an egg. He read aloud, letting the flourishes play as music. "He writes as if he wears his rings when he writes, and hears them click on the table. He says the ovens can bake enough bread to shame a hungry god. He says he has salt enough for a siege and patience enough for a winter. And he asks whether I like my lampreys in pie or in eel broth. Lampreys in pie, Margaery said gravely. A man who does not choose lampreys in pie will always be at war with his own kitchens. And with his heart, we will tell him pie, and ask him to send the broth to the Lannisters with our compliments. Robb had the sudden, foolish picture of a crate, arriving at the Red Keep's kitchen door, with a pretty letter tied to its lid, and a cook lifting it, suspicious, cautious, and finding beneath the lid only the smell of something good that would not cross their lips. He put the picture away. The map waited. The river lines were as known to him as the bones of his hand. The green reach marks Margaery had added with a careful pen had begun to look as if they had always been part of the parchment. Garland rides with Edmure, he said. The Great John too. I would have sent the Blackfish if I could have split him into 2 men. But I want him here. Walder Frey will count numbers and insult them. But he will also count names. Garland will seem a courtesy to him, and the Great John a warning, and between them, there may be a path, if a path exists at all. He will think he's being flattered and cowed both, Margaery said. Men of that sort like the taste of both on their tongues. We will send Frey more food than he can eat, and put our own knives at our own plates. We will send him a gift, Robb said, and the 2 words felt like picking the right stone for the right sling. Something to make him chatter. A box of pins in the shapes of fish and roses, to prick his fingers? She said, amused. A bell for each of his daughters, Robb said. Each of his granddaughters too, if we can count them by sunset. With ribbons. The Blackfish will laugh at me, and I will endure it. The girls will tie them to their wrists and their ankles. They will run through that hall ringing, and he will be forced to be pleased, if only to shove the noise out with his own. That, she said, is a Reach thought. It is also a Northern one. You are learning both sentences. Bendero. He put his hand over hers without looking at it, then remembered himself, and looked because he had learned that she liked to be seen, and not only felt. There was flour on the back of her hand, a dusting that had not been there when she had sat down. You have been in the kitchens again, he said. I have been in the ovens, she said. And I've been in the yard where the boys load the carts, and I have watched them tie knots that will slip and told them not to. Your men pretend they do not like being told by me. Then they come and ask me if I will tell them again. Then so. He did not say he knew it. He did not say that his men had begun to wear the look that boys have when something new and good begins to belong to them. He ate another heel of bread and thought of the Frey's bells, and thought of the old bridge where men had paid a toll for so long, they believed it part of a river's nature. Before noon, the yard turned itself into an argument of banners. Men packed and repacked their gear. At the same time they told the men near them to pack theirs differently. Garland Tyrell came armored plain, as if he meant to look like a man of fewer songs. The Great John clapped him on the shoulder with a sound like 2 boards meeting and laughed in his face, which is how the Great John made friends. Edmure walked among his men with a face too careful to be a truly brave man's, but nonetheless loved by them, because he knew their stories and remembered them without writing them down. Olenna Tyrell came to the step of her carriage with a shawl over her head like a winter wife. She lifted it and fixed Margaery with a look that made men step out of the way, though neither woman moved. You will not go to the twins yet, Olenna said, as if answering a protest that had not been made. Not yet, Margaery said. Soon enough. And when I go, I will walk in with my own bread. Bread is the right word, Olenna said. It is always the right word. Bread and knives. Bread first. She turned to Robb without waiting for Margaery to answer. Are you going to hang that Northerner when he does the stupid thing he is thinking of doing? She asked as if she were asking whether he preferred honey to jam. Which Northerner? Robb asked, because there were always several. The one whose grief has fermented and is beginning to fizz, Olenna said. The tall one who wears his hair like a field no one bothered to harvest. Rickard Karstark, Robb said, not smiling. If he kills boys under my peace, I will be the man my father raised me to be. You could also be a man who delays and makes use of his anger, Olenna said. But you are a Stark, and will do it the Stark way. Very well. I will have the kitchens make more bread. She let the shawl fall back into place and climbed into the carriage with the slow, inexorable grace of an old cat, finding a windowsill. Margaery laughed, just enough to ease the air that had tightened when the old woman had spoken, and then set her hand on Robb's arm as if to keep his temper in the same place. "Do you think I cannot hear the fizzing?" he asked. "I think you can hear it," she said. "I think you need to decide what song you will play over it, so the men hear that louder." The party for the twins left at an hour that used to be called decent, when men had no reason to move faster. Hooves struck water from the ruts into little silver flares. The Tyrell green lay among the river colors like a new leaf among old stones. Garland rode not immediately at Edmure's side but near, as a man who keeps his presence as a comfort and not a threat. The Great John bellowed 3 times, and once even the horses seemed to laugh. River Run felt larger for the absence, and then it felt exactly its size, as a house does when some of its people are away and some are home. The rhythms changed. A woman came with a bucket and washed the step as if insult lay in the dirt, and she would take it away with water. Loras Tyrell, who had not gone, took to practicing with a spear heavier than he preferred, and learned to make his wrists do the right work. Meg Mormont watched him once and told him a thing about bears, and he tried it and found she was right and was surprised to know he was pleased by that. Randall Tarley counted and recalculated and made a list of pikes that needed work, and then put the list aside to go and check if the work had been done, not because he did not trust the list, but because he did not trust any list made by a man not wearing a hammer in his belt. Roose Bolton asked the maester for ink and paper, and wrote with a precise hand to men whose names sounded like knives put gently back into their places in a roll. On the second day after the party's departure, Robb rode out with 70 men to look upon the fords where the Lannister men might attempt some pretty trick. He stood with his boots wet and felt how the current pulled and pushed at once. He looked very long at a row of willows and imagined them with their feet washed out in a flood or burnt down to stumps in a fire. He said to Karstark, who had come without being asked and stood with his grief like a black dog at his heel, "If you were Tywin Lannister and meant to come across, where would you set your ladders?" Karstark did not answer immediately. "I would not come across here at all," he said. "I would go around and burn someone's little brother. Then I would stand on their ashes and call across that I had brought a present." "Do not make me hang you," Robb said. He had not meant to say it, but now it stood in the air, and it would be childish to clap a hand over it and pretend it had not. "If you touch a boy under my protection, I will be the man you expect me to be." Rickard's mouth moved like a wound beginning to heal and not liking the stitch. "If I touch them," he said, and then stopped himself, and then added, "I will not, because there is still work I want to do that requires my head to be fixed to my neck." "Good," Robb said. "Keep it on." He did not keep it on. The day broke mild. The bread came from the ovens in long loaves with neat scores that let the crust lift like small doors to show heat and softness beneath. Margaery sent 3 baskets to the far barracks, and 1 to the infirmary, and 1 to the kitchen of a woman who had not been a cook long enough to have the courage to salt as she ought. She added a small pot of salt to that basket, with a folded note that simply said, "More." She stood in the yard to watch 2 squads work on changing from a spear formation into one that would meet mounted men without losing the front line. She corrected them twice, and the second time the surgeon did not take offense, which pleased her more than being right. When she turned to go in, a page ran to her with a face as white as if he had licked milk and found ashes in it. "My lady," he said breathlessly. "My queen." She wanted to correct him and did not, because the boy needed to speak and would speak better if she did not change his mouth's shape. "What is it?" she asked gently. "They've... Sir Rickard." "There was blood," he said, and she listened past his words to the gaps between them and found what she needed. By the time she reached the East Tower, Brynden Tully had already reached it. Robb was there with him. So quickly that the steps might have bent out of the way to let him pass. 2 guards were on their knees in a confusion of apologies that blundered into one another and lost their sense. By the door, where rust had made a design around the hasp that looked like a flower if a man were in the mood to forgive iron, lay a scarf whose knot had been tied in haste and cut with deliberation. Beyond the door, the smell had set itself in the air. The hot iron smell that is in every armory and every farrier's stall, and in every room where one man has let another man's blood. Robb went in. He did not reach for his sword. He went in with his hands, because there were boys to disengage from a world. He was not first. Brynden had been before him. The blackfish's mouth had lost its humor. The pale, familiar faces on the straw were not quite the ones he knew from supper, because death does a thing at once small and total. Their hair had not changed color, one darker, one with the pale gold that grows in the West like an ingredient in bread, but their scalps seemed both more and less real. Their mouths were slightly open. Robb could not bring himself to close them. He had done that once for a man called Torrin when he himself had been barely a man, and the weight of the eyelids on his fingertips had troubled him for months after. "Willem," Brynden said. "And Martin. Lannisters," Robb said. And then, because that was a word for a device on a banner, and for a strong room of men who made and broke oaths, and for a woman who had smiled at him as a boy and pleased him, and frightened him both, he said, "Boys." Ser Rickard came with 4 men, said a guard. The sense of his speech collecting itself now, the king had brought it to heel. He said he had orders to move the prisoners. He said, the way men who have a right speak, and we let him. Robb did not say you did not let him, he took. He put a hand out and set it on the lintel, and felt how cold the stone could be even in summer. He could feel Margaery in the doorway without turning, by the way the air changed. He could smell on her the kitchen's sour-sweet tang of fermenting dough, and the herb she wore that smelled like something green bruised under a thumb. He stared down at the boys. He did not stand very long. He stood long enough that he would not be able to pretend afterward that he had not looked, or that he had looked at something else. "Find Ser Rickard," he said. Brynden was already at the door. The Godswood had never looked more like a court. The White Trunk watched. The leaves, which had been idling in their patient way, found a wind and accepted it. Robb stood where he had stood to tie the wedding ribbon, and Karstark stood across from him, with his hands roped in front of him, like a prize bull brought for judgment. "You killed them," Robb said. He wanted to ask a question. He made his voice a statement. He had learned that men like Rickard Karstark answered questions with spittle and pride. He had learned that statements were a kind of mercy, because they spared a man from showing his throat as he lied. "I did," Karstark said, and put his head up as if the word gave him height. "I killed the wolf that bit my sons by killing the pups." "They were not the wolf," Robb said. "They were boys under my protection." "Your protection," Rickard said, as if the 2 words were a flaw in masonry that had let in rain. "Your protection. Your father's killer went free under your protection once. Your pretty southern wife, no offense to your queen who is prettier and perhaps less marked by sin, did what she did under your protection. Your protection is a thin blanket in a winter night, boy." "Bend him now." Robb could have taken the word boy and thrown it back. He did not. He looked to either side and saw his men. He saw the Karstark men looking at him, not as at a king, but as at a question they would answer for themselves in a day, a week, a winter from now, when their own hunger and pride asked it of them. He heard a bird call, a short note, as if the day had been pricked. "Your grief is not a license," Robb said. He tasted the winter in his own voice, and was not ashamed. "You killed boys whose hands were tied and whose mouths were quiet. You did it in my house. You did it under my banners. I will pass the sentence and I will swing the sword." "Do it then," Karstark said, and smiled a smile that was all shadow and receding light. "Do it, and watch the men who would have followed you to the end of the river go home. Do it, and watch your banners thin, until a breeze could take them. Do it, and marry your southern queen, and hope she bakes enough bread to feed the holes you made." "Man-show." Margaery stood on the edge of the clearing. Her face had the stillness of a water surface when the bottom roils with fish. She did not speak. Catelyn stood on the other side, a little behind Brynden. Her mouth was a flat line that had not been born yesterday. She had known what Robb would do as soon as he had stood, looking at those boys. She did not want it. She wanted it anyway. There are moments when a man discovers that the thing he thought he could not do is the thing he will be afterwards. Robb walked to the block. He did not look at Karstark's men. He did not look at Margaery. He pulled the sword from the scabbard, Valyrian steel, dark as the inside of an honest knight, a ripple in it like water that remembers wind, and set it on his shoulder a moment to feel its weight settle into his bones, the way a burden will when a man admits it. He did not speak the words. Ned Stark had spoken. He did not promise that the man who passes sentence should swing the sword. He did not make a lesson out of a death. He did not tell the trees that they would like him better if he lied to them soothingly. Rickard Karstark did not kneel until a guard pushed him once, lightly. And then he went down with a sudden obedience as if he remembered a time when he had kneeled for something else. The wind chose then to shift and brought into the godswood the smell of the ovens, the clean heat, the thing that says life and not law. Robb closed his eyes and opened them again. He lifted the sword. He brought it down. After, he stood long enough not to be asked to move. He turned his head only when he felt Margaery's presence closer, a pressure in the air like the approach of a storm that would not break yet. She did not touch him in the godswood. He was grateful. Catelyn's hands were on one another so tightly that her knuckles had gone white and stayed white after she let go. The Karstark men made the sound horses make when they see fire and stubble, and cannot tell which way the rider will make them go. Some left. Not all. In the solar, he put his hands in the water bowl and watched the pink wash curl and vanish. He had to change the water twice before it ran clear. Margaery came when he was wiping his hands on a towel that had once been white and was now a pale brown that told its own stories. She shut the door. He listened to the click and felt, absurdly, as if he had taken off a piece of iron. Say it, he told her, because he had married a woman who would say it, and because he did not want to love her less by asking her to be quiet, where he had asked men to die because they could not. You did what you believed the gods required of you, she said, and what your father requires in your bones. You cut your banners as you cut his head. We will sow. Now, he sat. He did not realize until then that his legs had that trembling in them that comes when a man has spent too long fighting a good fight with a better weapon than his body. She stood behind him and set her hands on his shoulders. She did not need. She set them there as a woman puts a cloth on a table before she brings the bread. He put his head forward and let the weight of it sit in the cradle of his spined neck. We will send riders to Karhold, she said. We will send bread. We will send cloth. We will send a mason if they need one, and a singer if they will suffer one. We will write to the men who are not fools among them and tell them there is a place at our fire if they will not turn away from it. And we will set men loyal to you between their men and the roads, so that if they ride to treachery they will have to spend themselves before they arrive. Oh, Harrion is a captive, he said, remembering with a small shock that grief is also logistics. Karhold has no lord to send me a letter, I would believe. Then we will write to the women, Margaery said. And he turned his head half toward her because the sentence was both simple and new. To the wives of the men who left and the wives of the men who stayed. We will write to a girl called Alice if there is such a girl, and to an aunt if there is such a woman, and to a steward if there is a steward who has eyes. We will send them salt and candle ends and good needles and tell them who sent them. And we will not waste men on trying to convince the convinced. There are always some who would rather be hungry with their anger than full with their pride wounded. We will let them choose their winter. No. He breathed and heard the sound the breath made as if it were someone else. The bowl of water on the table caught a ribbon of light and wore it around itself as a cheap woman wears a rich man's favor. He saw for a moment, not with his eyes, the two boys' faces, the small stiffness that had crept into the corners of their mouths, as if the world had pinched them there, and they had not had time to forgive it. The anger came as it would, and then went, as it must if he were to go on becoming. In the yard, the Karstark men left in ones and twos. The ones who stayed kept their eyes lowered and then learned to raise them, because leaving is not always a matter of feet, and there is only so long a man can stare at the same knot in a plank without going blind to all knots. Olenna sent for the quartermaster and asked him whether the men who had gone would take the blankets meant for them with them. And when he, uncertain whether to be offended, said yes, she said, "Good. Then they will be warm while they are thinking of how wrong they were." Randall Tarley told the forge master to count the spearheads again and not let sentiment keep him from writing the numbers down twice. Loras stood a while by the tree where the block had been dragged, and then went and asked Mage Mormont for another lesson, and did not call the lesson that because he knew better and liked himself more for knowing. Roose Bolton left for Harrenhal the next morning with a company whose quiet spoke more of danger than noise would have. He looked back once from the far bank of the moat, with a face that was as easy to read as a plain book held upside down in the dark. Robb watched him go and wished for a moment that men like boats were required by custom to hang a lamp outside their hulls that told you what sort of cargo they carried. Then he laughed at himself, because that is how a man becomes a fool. He did not laugh when the raven came with a scrap of parchment from the west, carried not from a man with a coat of arms, but from a man with a shop. It said in small, careful letters that the gold cloaks had been paid with new gold, and that this was the sort of news that sometimes meant nothing, and sometimes meant that men who thought they were owned by one house had been hired by another. It bore the trace of wine and the faintest scent of smoke, as if the man had written with a cup near his hand and a candle too close to his elbow. Robb folded the note and put it with Wyman Manderley's flourish-swathed reply, and with Edmure's report, and with a scrap of ribbon cut from the wedding cloth. Sometimes a man's rule is a sheaf of papers under a small river stone. The road to the twins did what roads do in that country. It soaked and dried. It stood and slid. It let wheels sink and pulled hooves up clean. The days were the right length for riding and the wrong length for patience. Garland Tyrell did not sing. When asked why he did not, he said simply that he kept his breath for the work he had chosen. The Great John sang, which is to say he made noise against the air, and the air learned to enjoy it because it could not do otherwise. Edmure grew quieter as they went, as men do when they approach the house where the thing they want and the thing they fear both wait. The twins sat squat and pleased with themselves, the towers like two fat men on stools that had held far more weight than anyone expected them to without breaking. The bridge ran like a scar between them. Walder Frey had never bothered to make his house beautiful. He had made it necessary. That is, if a man is honest, a sort of beauty. They sent their man with the basket of bells first, because a gift looks best when it arrives like a spill of laughter, instead of like a tax. The Frey who came down to take it tried not to grin and failed, and then tried to scowl and failed, and then gave up and rang one of the bells himself without meaning to. By the time Garland and Edmure and the Great John rode into the yard, the bells were ringing from at least 4 ankles and 3 wrists and 1 plait of hair, and the Great John laughed until he needed to put a hand on the pommel to set himself right. Lord Walder received them with his mouth already open. He had eyes like a pond that does not like people throwing stones into it, and a mouth that had learned to talk men into believing they were guilty of breaking rules they had not known existed. "You come with banners," he said, "as if you owned the road. We come with bells," Garland said mildly, and the old man's eyes slid to him and considered him for a new sort of fool. "You bring pretty, Tyrell," Walder said. "Will you bring pretty to my tables? Will your cooks work for me?" "Then?" "They will not," Garland said, with exactly the right amount of regret and exactly the right amount of indifference. "But my purse will. You will put coin on my table like salt," Walder said, "and think that makes you family." "It makes us neighbors," Garland said, "and neighbors are sometimes more useful." Edmure stood very straight and let the 2 men circle. He counted 15 frays in the hall before he lost the thread and gave up trying. The doors opened and a girl came in with a bowl, and though Edmure had braced himself against it, he still felt his heart jump with the foolishness of a boy when he realized that this girl, and not another, would carry his children. Rosalind Frey had a face like a memory a man tries not to cheapen by keeping in his pocket. It did not ask to be admired. It asked to be treated carefully. She looked once at Edmure and then away, which was exactly the right number of times for a girl to look at a man before he had earned more. Walder made a speech that would have killed a weaker man and tried, game to kill him. Edmure bowed in the right places and nodded in the others, and kept his hands clear of his sword hilt because the Grey John had told him cheerfully that the phrase counted such things and made notes of them the way other men make notes about where to plant beans. When the bread and salt came, it came on their plates and on Frey plates both, because Brynden Tully had taught them that courtesy is safer than cunning, when a man like Walder makes it look as if courtesy and cunning are the same. The wedding itself was a thing done properly and loudly. Garland danced with 3 Frey girls in a row, and did not step on any toes, and gave each of them a respect that would be remembered for 10 winters. The Grey John drank a challenge into the air, and then insisted on drinking it back down to show that he meant it. Rosalind walked as if she had learned to do so on reed beds that sway, and yet do not let a girl sink. And when she put her hand in Edmur's, it looked less like surrender, and more like a promise the 2 of them would learn to keep together. Walder smiled like a man who has found a copper where he had dropped a silver, and expects to be praised for his honesty. The bells ran through the hall like one of the little rivers that find their way to the Red Fork by agreeing to be small until it matters. If a knife had been hidden under the tablecloth, if men had stood up at a sign and begun to sing a song that was not a song at all, if the bridge had been pulled up and the towers turned into throats, there would have been enough bread on the northern tables and enough men from 2 directions watching the door to make the surprise less deadly than it would otherwise have been. But there were no knives under the cloth. There were knives where knives always are, under hands and behind eyes, and they watched one another and decided not to move. Walder Frey ate his bread, and then he ate more bread, and then he ate meat. And for the first time in years, his hall smelled more richly of roast than of old wood. He had been given a song to sing about his family, and a number of the girls had bells on their wrists, and a man must be very determined to be miserable to not allow himself to be amused by bells. Edmure lay with Rosalind in a bed that had seen a lack of tenderness and thought, briefly, that it would be a good thing if he was the first man to put some there in a way that stuck. Rosalind talked as a girl talks in a dark room away from stern eyes. She told him that she liked the river more than the bridge, and that she had once seen a kingfisher that looked like a piece of sky had fallen into the water and then flown back into the air. Edmure closed his eyes and saw the bird, and thought that he would bring her one of the little feathers a man sometimes finds on the river path when the bird leaves them. He slept for a little while and dreamed of a house that did not smell like iron and old soup. 2 days later, the party rode out and left Walder Frey standing in his yard and looking as if he had counted all the people and found that the total came to the right number, which disappointed him because he had hoped for the pleasure of scolding someone. He watched the bells on the girls' wrists. He watched until they turned into dots and then into nothing. He went inside and found a boy who was not his son and hit him on the ear for dropping a cup and felt better. At River Run, Bread and Law moved on their tracks, sometimes crossing, sometimes one waiting while the other went past. The supply lists grew and then shrank like the river's own edges. The first barges from the Mander reached White Harbor, and Wyman Manderley wrote a letter that made the maester laugh out loud while reading it, and then cough and pretend he had not, because it spoke of pies again, and of how the sea smelled that morning, and how gulls were fools who nonetheless found their way home in storms, as men sometimes did not. He wrote also that he had begun to speak quietly to men along the coast who had boats and to men in the city who had hands, and that both kinds of men were eager to be useful in ways that would make their houses look prettier to the history that would be written later. "Tell him," Margaery said when Robb handed her the letter and she had smiled at the line about gulls, "that if he finds his way to sending us flour that does not taste of a rat, we will carve him on a pillar in our house, somewhere only we will see." "Somewhere a fat man would not mind being carved," Robb said, relieved to feel the humor move in him like clean air in a close room. He began to hold councils that were more like conversations around a table than like a man's speech delivered from a step. The maps lay between them, but he learned to rely also on the smaller sorts of wisdom that men who run roads and stables and ovens carry in their fingers. He put a steward from the Reach next to a butcher from the Trident and a bowman from the Neck next to Loras Tyrell, and watched the lines drawn across the table and marveled that some of them held. He let Mage Mormont tell him that you could sometimes smell a storm in a bear's fur a day before it came, and he let Randil Tarley tell him that you could smell discipline if you walked into a barracks and heard the silence between men's jokes. At night, he would sometimes wake and sit, the way children sit to listen to rain. Margaery would wake in the same instant, more often than not. She did not ask him what he had remembered. He did not ask her what she had just been willing to forget. He would say, if he spoke at all, "The Ironborn," and she would say, "The Kraken follows blood in the water until there's none left that interests it." And then they would lie back down. Once she said, "When I was a girl, my grandmother taught me the names of all the flowers and all the men who thought they could use those flowers as a reason to talk to me." He said, "When I was a boy, my father taught me the names of all the men who would die in his service, and to never pretend I had not learned them at all." She said, "We will not forget," and he said, "We will also not let remembering be the only thing we do." A raven came from the neck with tidings that sounded like wind in reeds. Talk of Lannister scouts testing the fringes, of strange fires seen at night, of men with rough speech and iron on their clothes, who would not say who paid them. Roose Bolton sent word from Harrenhal that the place was like a mouth that had tasted too many meats cooked the wrong way, and now could not tell hunger from disgust. He wrote that Qyburn, a man who called himself a maester, though he had lost his chain, knew the names of all the drafts that let a man die quieter, and of some that made him speak again of things he had meant to keep. Robb read that sentence twice, and wished it had not been written by a man who wrote so neatly. The day Edmure rode back from the twins with Garland and the Great John, the yard turned itself into something better than a parade, and not quite a battle. The men who had remained at River Run tasted the dust as if it were wine. Rosalind was with them. She looked smaller in the saddle than she had looked in Walder's Hall, and more real. Catelyn met her on the step and kissed her cheek, and looked into her face with the practical tenderness of a woman who wants to know where to set another chair at a table that has been too lonely for the number of bodies in the room. Walder had sent gifts, which ranged from the insulting to the thoughtful without much pattern. There was a gelding with better bone than any man expected from those stables. There was a piece of baked bread so stiff that it must have been made by a man who had no teeth and resented those who did. There were 2 small girls who had run after the horses with their bells, and whom Catelyn sent back with 3 baskets of linen, and a stern note reminding Lord Frey that daughters are not presents. There was also a piece of paper in a boy's hand that said that another piece of paper in a man's hand would arrive later with a list of requests. Demands, the boy had written first, and then scratched it out and written, requests, and then left the scratchings as if to say he had told the truth somewhere. The Great John laughed until Rosalind smiled at the sound the way a girl smiles when she hears a big dog and knows it has been trained. Garland took Robb aside. He wanted to see if he could shame me into staying, he said. He made a speech about neighbors and fences. I told him that where I come from, men who want better fences pay for more wood and better carpenters, and he tried not to smile and failed. He will try something later, but it will not be the thing he tried in the story you were afraid of. He has learned the sound of bells and finds he likes it. Bah. Good, Robb said. Then, thank you. That is what you say to a man who has done what you would have done for him, Garland said. And what I say to you is that the Great John is a joy and a terror, and that if he is ever bored for more than a day, the hall will not be safe. The Ironborn tried again, on a night when the moon was a bitten coin. They came up through the pines with axes wrapped, and teeth wrapped, and feet wrapped, and their breath wrapped too, because even raiding can be done with a certain reverence for the way sound carries over snow. Galbart Glover sent a raven that reached River Run with a wing that looked as if something with teeth had tried to hold it. He wrote that he would hold Deepwood Motte until his hand forgot the way to open, but he would hold it better if the wolves he called his king would send a pack. Robb's mouth had the taste of iron in it that morning. He felt the particular longing that comes to men who have river water in their blood and are asked to think about the sea. He called the council. He watched the 2 rivers of advice, north and south, flow together and then spread apart, and then find eddies where strange fish flashed. Randall Tarley argued for a swift, hard stroke with men who liked to sleep under trees. Loras argued for patience and horses. Mage argued for bears and boats. Brynden argued for something between all 3, a twist that would catch raiders where they expect to be the caught. We will not let Barrowton suffer for our attention elsewhere, Margaery said. And we will not let Deepwood's boys learn that calling for help is like shouting into a well. But we will not leave the Riverlands naked. There's cloth enough to make more than one shirt. Bow. We will send men from White Harbor by sea, Robb said. The Manderley ships are fat, but not foolish. They can carry bears if the bears permit it. We will tell Lord Manderley to do what he would have done without me telling him, and to do it faster. We will set men from Tallheart and Hornwood to hold the woods behind the Ironborn, so they do not find the paths they think they find. And we will send a letter to Barrowton that says the king has not forgotten the smell of pine trees. And no, we will also write to Stannis Baratheon, Margaery said in the silence that followed the last name. The men around the table looked at her, because the name had the taste of old fire and new salt. We will write to him and tell him that if he means to be king of all, he must be king of some. And we will tell him that he will find the North is more likely to pay attention to him when the North is not preoccupied with being flayed by an Iron Man. Randyll Tarly frowned. You propose to invite a Baratheon into our house. I propose to invite him to stand in the yard and be told there is no food left for him, she said, which men like him prefer to being ignored. Robb thought about the letter he would write. He thought of the words he would not use. He thought of the way ink looks on parchment when a man writes with his jaw set. He thought of Catelyn's face when she read the name Stannis, and then he saw her face and found it gentler than the picture in his mind. He is a man, she said. He must be spoken to as a man. He is also a storm, and we must lash down what we do not want him to take. Write to him. Do not promise him what you cannot afford to give him. Tell him the truth as you see it. There is nothing else to be done with men like him. Men and show. So the ravens went, one to White Harbor, one to Barrowton, one to Deepwood Motte with a promise folded into a ribbon of blue and gray, because Margaery had begun to believe that even promises deserved to be dressed properly. One to Dragonstone addressed to a king and written by a king who did not intend to kneel. The ravens took the air as naturally as a thrown plant takes earth if it has roots. In the yard, as the men drilled, Loras Tyrell stood with Mage Mormont and learned not to lean forward into a charge, but to set his weight as if he were a tree that had known storms and liked them. He wiped sweat from his face with the back of his hand and left a dark streak along his cheek and did not care. You move like a dancer, Mage told him, and sometimes that will kill you. Learn to move like this. He learned. The Mormont women liked him better for his willingness to be ridiculous. He liked them better for not liking him until he deserved it. Olenna sat with Catelyn and mended as if she were not a woman who could order men to mend for her. She said, "Do you remember when you were a girl and thought the worst thing that could happen to a woman was to be embarrassed at a feast?" Catelyn said, "I thought the worst thing that could happen to a woman was to be sent to a house where she did not love the man she was to spend all her days with." Olenna said, "That is not the worst thing. The worst thing is to never learn the names of the girls who carry the jugs. If you do not learn them, you will not notice when one is missing." Catelyn said, "I learned that too late. I will not again." When the first sacks of Reach grain reached the Trident by cart, under a sky that had finally decided to let the sun in properly without scolding it for being in the wrong place, the men who lifted them onto the platforms and into the storehouses did so with the satisfaction that comes of putting weight in the right place. A boy who had never eaten a loaf of bread that had not been cut thin for fear the loaf would not last cried when he saw whole loaves stacked like firewood. A woman who had taken to watering milk for the last month took the handle of a jug and felt, for the first time in a year, that her wrist did not ache with wanting. The maester wrote in his book that 12 score sacks had arrived, and that 3 had burst on the way, and that 1 had been cut by a man's knife on purpose, and that the man's name had been written down, not to have him whipped, but to remember that hunger is clever. The night their bed held them, and the room held the night like a bowl, and the bowl did not spill. Robb said into Margaery's hair, "When I cut Karstark's head, I thought my father would approve of me. Then I thought he would be ashamed. Then I realized that both thoughts were the same thought wearing different boots." She said, "When I sent a basket of bells to Walder Frey, I thought I was being clever. Then I thought I was being kind. Then I thought I was distracting myself from the fact I was afraid. Then I decided that if bells can be all three, they will ring better. Da. He laughed, and the laugh shook something loose in him that had needed shaking. She put her hand on his chest and felt the beats and counted them without caring about numbers. The fire on the hearth settled. Gray Wind moved on the other side of the door and lay his head back down with a sigh that sounded like a man resigning himself to something good. In the morning, there was frost on the barrels where beer had sweated the night before, and the frost had that particular glitter that says the day will be clean. A boy ran across the yard and did not fall, which in itself is a kind of victory in a place where there are stones. The smith lifted a pair of tongs from the fire, and the light caught the iron like river on steel. The Raven from White Harbor arrived with blue thread tied to its leg and a note from Wyman that contained a drawing of a pie that made Margaery's mouth water and a list of the ships that had gone out. Their names so fine and foolish. Golden Leak, Mother's Mercy, Lamprey's Luck, that Robb smiled to read them. He read other names too. Theon Greyjoy, Winterfell, a captain of the watch who signed his name with an X because he had never needed the letters before and now had decided to introduce himself to them. The words were not yet the words of a siege. They were the words of a house that had been made to listen to a kind of knock it did not deserve. He stood with the message in his hand long enough for the page to grow nervous and then grow calmer again, and then remember that he ought to be nervous. He folded the paper and put it away. He did not call for his horse. He called for men with good eyes. "We will not move our whole house for a rumor," he said after an hour with Brynden and Catelyn, and the men and women who had begun to think of the table as an altar upon which maps and promises lay. "We will send ravens to Tallhart and Hornwood and to Sir Roderick if he holds. We will ask Manderley to send the ships he has already sent, and then to send more, and pretend I did not tell him to. We will send a quiet party to the Barrows with a gift for Lady Dustin, because there is always a woman in the Barrows who will tell you the truth if you ask her as if you expect her to lie. And we will not let the Lannisters believe that the North's heart can be made to forget its head." He looked at Margaery and saw her nod. "We will also send something to the villages near Winterfell that is not a sword," she said. "A letter and a piece of cloth with the king's colors on it and a sack of salt and a small cask of sweet. We will tell them to hide their flour where no man who does not know the places a woman hides things would think to look. We will not let the Ironmen eat our winter." He said, "Our winter," and liked the taste of it, as if it were the heel of a good loaf. He did not stand and say that he would go north tomorrow. He did not send a present to the godswood. He sent men to count and to lift. He sent women to count and to lift. He sent Garland to the river, crossing to see how men looked when they thought they were not being seen. He sent Loras to the infantry squares to see how men looked when they knew a pretty knight watched them and tried to look less clumsy than they were. That night, as if the day had not contained enough for ordinary people, there was a storm. It came across the fields like a lord who has overstayed his welcome and then remembered that he had a good story left to tell and came back to tell it. The thunder sounded like stones falling into water deep enough to swallow them without fuss. The lightning made lines on the inside of the eyelids of men who had shut them to sleep. The rain sluiced, and the roofs thought about it and bore it. Grey Wind did not care for thunder and set his muzzle on the sill as if scent might teach him the sky's language. Margaery lay awake and counted the spaces between rumbles with a child's superstition that meant very little and comforted anyway. Robb slept the sleep of a man who had made decisions and would wake to make more. She sat up after a while and went to the arrow slit and looked out at a world that had gone from dark to darker and yet somehow looked more honest for being drenched. She thought of Highgarden in rain. It is a soft, round thing. Rain in the reach. It makes the air taste green and the earth smell like a kitchen. Here it had a straighter edge. It was a man's rain. She put her palm against the stone and felt the seep of the chill. She let it sink into her until she could feel both houses in her bones. The warm and the cold, the round and the straight. She did not feel torn. There are some women who, when asked to be two things, decide to be both without moving. she decided. In the morning, the storm had scoured everything the eye could see until it looked as if it had been new built. The men on the wall blinked in the sudden wealth of light. A boy who had spent the night in the stables because a mare had foaled there, and he had made excuses to keep his hands on something living, looked older because he had watched a life come that could not be ordered. The foal stood on legs too long for itself, and did that soft-kneed sway that makes even hard men laugh. A raven came with a seal that made the maester's mouth pinch. It was Tywin Lannister's hand. The words inside were simple and heavy, like iron bars set across a door. He wrote that the Reach had betrayed, and that there is nothing so tiresome as a garden that decides to be a forest. He wrote that he would water the ground with the blood of men who believed themselves wolves in a country that did not like wolves. He wrote that a marriage was a very small thing, and the sort of thing men did when they had nothing else to do. He wrote, too, at the end, that he looked forward to meeting the young wolf, without needing to look up to speak to him. Robb read the letter twice, and then put it on the table, as if one puts down meat that smells just slightly off, and decides to give it to the dogs. No one spoke. Then Margaery said, "He will do as he has always done. He will count and count again, and pay men to do what he will not be seen to do. He will tell himself he is not angry because men like him do not like to be seen as angry. And he will be angrier for it. And he will send men," Randyll Tarly said, as if putting a foot on the first rung of a ladder. "And we will meet them as if we expected them," Brynden said. "And we will make certain that before they meet us, they meet empty storehouses," Margaery said. "Let him be angry and hungry both." "We will send riders to the Oak," Robb said, and meant the Oakheart lands without saying them. "We will send word to Tarly's cousins and his enemies, and ask them which they would rather be. They will choose what they always choose," Randyll said. "But it will be useful to ask them." "Useful to be seen asking them," Margaery said. And the small look that moved between Tarly and her was one of respect that had not known it would be born today. They broke the day into tasks. Not because that is the way to fill a page, but because that is the way men and women make a day bear its weight. Catelyn went to the linen stores and counted. Olenna went to the kitchen and told a boy who had been stealing sugar to stop, and told him she would make him a sweet once a week if he did. The boy believed her with the speed that children reserve for grandmothers, with sharp tongues. Loras went to the drilling field again and learned to plant his feet, and to let his pretty mouth be ugly for a while. Maeg went to the prow of a barge and looked at the water with a face that made the water not want to misbehave. Robb, after he had done the larger things, did a small one. He walked the long passage that runs between the kitchens and the armory, the one where the damp sometimes collects on the stones in delicate, treacherous puddles. He found a place where the wall had shelled a little, and put his hand on it, and told a boy to bring mortar. He stood while the boy brought it. He watched him work. The boy worked better for knowing the king would stand while he did. At dusk, he and Margaery went to the Godswood. The light was honeyed at the edges and iron in the middle, the sort of light that makes every leaf on the lower branches look like it has been picked out by the careful hand of a craftsman with a fine brush. Robb put his palm on the weirwood once, not to ask and not to apologize. Margaery did not reach for it. She stood near and imagined her hand without moving it, and decided that some days a woman did not need to touch a god to be faithful to him. "We will send someone to Winterfell," he said. "Not a host. A hand. A scout hand. A woman if we can, because men in leather are counted and women in linen are dismissed." "Nah. We will send a baker," she said at once. "We will tell Wyman to bury a woman in flour and have her arrive at the gate with a sack that smells like life. We will give her a message to say if anyone listens to her. We will tell her the names of 2 men in the kitchens, and 1 in the stables and 1 in the watch, and if they answer to those names, we will know the house is not wholly taken." He looked at her and thought, not for the first time, of what he had married. Not only a woman with roses sewn along her hem, but a woman with names of stable boys in her head like beads. He wanted to set his hands on her shoulders and press his forehead to hers, and say something like "thank you." "Only larger," he said instead because he was a Stark. "Good." And she laughed softly and counted it as poetry. Later, when the moon had lost its bite and the night had become properly dark, he woke and found his hand had reached for the place where she had been and was not. He sat up and saw her in the window again. The arrow slit now a taller shadow against the general dark. He went to her. He put his hands on the stone on either side of her and let his body make a shelter. She leaned back into him. The night had that feeling nights have when the world is thinking a thought it will not share until morning. "Tell me what you see," he said. "I see a road," she said. "I see it slow, like a ribbon pulled through careless fingers. I see a cart on it with a broken wheel, and a girl who has decided that she will walk if the wheel cannot be mended. I see a man with a torch who thinks the torch makes him a king. I see a river that will not stop for any of them. I see a house in the north that is cold, and ours impatient. Then, we will go to it," he said. "We will not run to it," she said. "We will walk with 1,000 feet. Do you ever doubt?" he asked. And it was the kind of question men ask when they can only bear the answer if the night is deep. "I doubt everything," she said at once, and he felt the relief of honesty like water when a man has walked too long in sun. "And then I decide. That is what being a queen is, I think. Doubt quickly and then be slow to move, and then move and be proud." He rested his brow on the back of her head. He thought of the old words that had guided his father's feet, and of the new ones that would have to be written before this was over. He thought of the Frey girl's bells. He thought of the iron smell of a room where the air had gone out and refused to come back. He thought of the taste of cheese that had known 3 summers. He thought of lamprey pie. He thought of the word "our," and how it sits heavily on a man's tongue until he decides to like its weight. The morning was already in the east, lying quiet and pale when he slept again. The night had told him nothing he did not already know, and had given him what nights give to men who use them properly: a place to put his thoughts until they forget how to bite. He woke with the sense that the table would have new papers on it, and that some of them would smell like wax, and some like fish, and some like the sweat of men who had run to deliver them. He was right. He rose. He put on his boots while the world was still thinking about whether to be day. On the table, there were 3 messages. One from Harrenhal with Roos's neat hand, reporting that the Lannisters had drawn back, and then forward again as if a needle had been threaded by a cautious old woman whose hands knew too much to be steady. One from White Harbor telling of 3 ships with ridiculous names, having made harbor at Barrowton under cover of fog, and of bears disembarking with the sullen dignity of queens, being made to visit the countryside. One small, crumpled, with a smear of something that might have been Greek. It said only this: "We are here." He held the scrap and felt its heat, as if paper could keep the warmth of a hand. He looked at Margaery. She nodded. "Then we will be 2, she said. "Not today, but in all the ways that matter." Outside, the day put itself together from light and wind and water. A boy walked across the yard with a loaf held high and did not drop it. The bells the Frey girls had taken had stopped ringing by now. But somewhere in the far cold of the north, a woman lifted a cloth and showed a man a bit of bread she had hidden where no soldier would think to look, and it smelled like life. The rivers went on speaking. The Godswood stood, the Reach and the North, tied with a ribbon cut, and yet unbroken, went on teaching each other the songs they had decided to share.